Welcome everybody to the second half of this conference. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Beheroz Shroff, who was born and brought up in Mumbai, and she's a long-time scholar of Siddhis. This is something that you're going to see in her presentation. She teaches in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California in Irvine. She has produced 5 documentaries on the Siddhis of Gujarat and also published widely on that community. And she has many ongoing research and film projects on contemporary Siddhi communities in 2 areas of India, in 2 states, in Gujarat and in Karnataka. And today she's going to speak about the Siddhis in Karnataka in South India. So over to you, Beheroz.
Thank you. You can hear me?
And hear you.
Very good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be at this conference where so many lively questions have come up. I think there are always more questions than answers. So my presentation is Portuguese and Afterlives of Siddhis of Karnataka. And I'm going to draw on, let me see. I'm going to move my screen. In this paper, I draw on Saidiya Hartman's compelling concept, Afterlives of Slavery, in order to place my discussion of Siddhis, Indians of African descent, in one region of India, Karnataka. And I have the map here to show you, this is Karnataka. And I will come to the other regions that I have marked on the map as well. Saidiya Hartman theorizes the afterlife of slavery in her work, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. And in some ways, I want to put my presentation in dialogue with the Atlantic Ocean slave route and the diasporic experiences of Africans in the Atlantic Ocean as compared to the afterlives of diasporic people in the Indian Ocean world. So Hartman's Afterlife of Slavery, as she calls it, speaks to the haunting presence of slavery's racialized violence within the contemporary societies for diasporic subjects. I agree with Hartman that the imprint of slavery exists in all sectors of society. For the Siddhis of Karnataka, slavery had established a measure of man and a ranking of life and worth that has yet to be undone. These are Hartman's words. This is the afterlife of slavery. Hartman, again quoting her, skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. What I would like to do also in this paper is to show the resilience of the Siddhis of Karnataka, whose afterlives are haunted by slavery's imprint and their assertion of agency in different ways to rebuild their lives. So the concept and its interpretation can be applied to Siddhis of Karnataka's historical, social, and political experiences. Just to give a brief background to the presence of Siddhis in the Indian Ocean world, Africans were brought to India through different trajectories of migration by Arab and Gujarati merchants and colonial rulers such as the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the English. Africans were known by different names: Abyssinians, Hapshis, Siddhis. In Goa, under Portuguese, they were sometimes known as Khapri, Kofres, and other names. Today, most African descended communities in India refer to themselves as Siddhis. They live in different regions of India, mostly in Gujarat. This is where the highest population is. In Gujarat, in Karnataka, in Hyderabad here. This is Goa, near Mumbai. So Goa and Mumbai are encircled right here. And sorry, this is Mumbai and this is Goa, correct. So this is where contemporary Siddhi populations can be found. Scholars estimate that there are about 60,000 Siddhis in India today, but the count is higher from the Siddhis themselves. They think it could be now 75,000 in Gujarat alone, and maybe a higher count in Karnataka as well. Also important to note is the fact that before the slave trade began with the Omani Arabs, Africans came to India as seafaring travelers and in different professions such as merchants, traders, sailors, entertainers, artists, and missionaries. And some established families by intermarrying with non-Africans. And here I'm quoting Shihan da Silva Jayasuriya and Pankhurst's text, which is like the basic text for Indian Ocean world history. The Portuguese Seaborne Empire, Estado da India, is an area that extended from Cape of Good Hope to the lower Yangtze River in China. Estado da India included Indian coastal areas of Goa, Daman, Diu, Nagar Haveli, and Dadra in southern India. And Portuguese ruled from 1505 to 1961. Goa was important to the Portuguese, and it therefore became their most important location in Asia. From here, they could supervise their discoveries, conquests, and markets. They brought in Africans to work as domestic servants, though they were also brought in as soldiers and supplied as military reinforcements to other Portuguese settlements like Macau and Ceylon, now called Sri Lanka. It is important for us to understand the Portuguese presence because it has, in particular, we have to understand Portuguese presence because of the migration patterns of Siddhis to northern Karnataka from the coastal areas ruled by Portuguese. Scholars believe that contemporary Siddhi communities who live now in Karnataka are those who escaped Portuguese-ruled Goa and ran away to the surrounding hills and forests. And some also in this community come from neighboring territories where the rulers were also not very benevolent towards the Africans. Scholar Jeanette Pinto quotes historian Antonio Boccaro, who estimated around 10 slaves per household owned by Portuguese settlers in Goa in 1635. She quotes Frenchman Jean de Thévenot, whose journals, Voyages, are also important to understanding the presence of Portuguese. Thévenot writes, the Portuguese have slaves in Daman of both sexes, Daman and Goa, which work and procreate only for their masters, to whom the children belong. Slaves performed all kinds of tasks. Slaves were handymen at home, on the farms, in the kitchens, and they also served their masters' shops. They built fortresses, carried their masters' weapons in war, transported the spoils of victory, and manned Portuguese ships to ensure that Portuguese will not die from overwork. This is Thevenot, close quotation. Many Portuguese masters were brutal. Not all were benevolent. And that accounts for the high number of escapees and runaways to neighboring territories. In fact, the Portuguese had made treaties with neighboring territories that the slaves had to be returned back to Goa, or else the neighboring king had to pay a fine, a penalty for harboring escapees. That colonizers continued to intervene in the afterlives of Siddhis in their new forest homes when they escaped and went into the hills of northern Karnataka is evidenced by the fact that the British arrived in 1779 and took over control of these forest areas of northern Karnataka, where the Portuguese had no more control. So there were two colonizers present in this area, Portuguese in Goa, and the British had arrived in the south. The British had come all the way down here. They were mostly in these areas, in Gujarat and these areas, but they had come all the way down and conquered this area, which was forest area. The British brought forest areas under their control and denied forest rights to indigenous people, that is, other people who they called tribals. Now we call them Adivasis, or indigenous people. And they called forest land reserved areas. Under the Forest Rights Act of 1865 and 1878, the British acquired monopoly rights. They banned shifting cultivation, by which indigenous communities and Siddhis had protected the overuse of land, which the British began to engage in as they planted eucalyptus and teak trees for commercial use and military use. So I continue to draw on Saidiya Hartman's analysis of afterlives as haunting the lives of Siddhis, even after they escaped Portuguese imperialism. They ran into British colonialism. And I will also discuss then the ongoing legacies of a traumatic past. After independence in 1947, the Indian government began to dominate the lives of Siddhis. Like the British, they continued to chart forest areas as state property. New state policies concerning management of forest areas impacted Siddhi communities. Later settlers from within other areas in India, particularly upper caste Havik Brahmins, dominated land ownership and negotiated with the British, leaving out Siddhis and other indigenous people. Siddhis began to go in debt to the Brahmins, from whom they borrowed money. And sometimes they went into debt because of lack of literacy skills. They could not understand all the transactions that were imposed on them. The Indian government, by the late 60s and 70s, the Indian government and its forest department imposed restriction on the use of land and collection of forest produce. They passed various laws targeting Siddhi's use of forest environment and employed forest security guards to enforce new forest laws. Along with the Siddhis, the original communities, indigenous communities like Kunabi, Halaki, Vokaliga, Gonda, and Guli also encountered forest officials' harassment because there was corruption, there was bribery, and forest officials often took bribes and looked the other way if the forest dwellers were procuring honey to sell in markets or procuring or using timber, bamboo, minor forest products to sell to keep up their livelihood. The area is very well known for its rich biodiversity, particularly sandalwood and teak trees and areca nut trees, among others. Having lived on land they themselves had cleared and nurtured, for Siddhis it was demeaning to be regarded as encroachers. Thus began the long struggle to regain rights over forest lands. Sorry, I had these slides and I forgot. This is Vasco da Gama's first voyage. Here is Vasco da Gama in Calicut, meets the Hindu ruler, the Zamarin in Calicut, May 1498. And this is a Siddhi family, contemporary Siddhi communities, and their homes that are so fragile and put together literally with very few resources. The long struggle to retain rights over forest lands began when Siddhis began their fight to obtain scheduled tribe status. Formed under the principal guidance of Cajetan Siddhi, in 1983, the All Karnataka Siddhi Development Association discussed urgent questions like dispossession of lands on which Siddhis worked and on their marginalized status. Cajetan Siddhi, who was an educated professional with experience as a forest rights official in administration, one of the few Siddhis who worked in forest rights admin, understood government policies and practices. Under his guidance, All Karnataka Siddhis Development Association, AXDA, decided to claim identity as scheduled tribe and indigenous community status. Even though they are not an indigenous people, the Siddhis claimed special recognition as original inhabitants of the forest terrain. They based these claims on their pioneering cultivation of forest land. Even with increased dispossession of land and their marginalized economic status. So they claimed we are the ones who have cleared the forests and made it cultivable. Now, what is scheduled tribe status? Under the Constitution of India, a special classification for indigenous people called Adivasis or original inhabitants was given in order to bring benefits and some form of reparation to communities that were left behind, to communities that were invisible to the mainstream and who were regarded from British times as backward or primitive, because these communities lived in isolation and fended for themselves. They were self-sufficient. They knew how to guard and protect the forest and live on forest land. They were not rich, but they were self-sufficient. The Siddhis' long, protracted fight, and I'm going to look at some Okay, here are some village women. Again, the house in the background, made with very few resources, is what I wanted to show. This is Cajetan Siddhi, his wife and son. He was one of the main founders of AXDA, All India Siddhi Development Association. And here is a protest and demonstration. Through these street protests and demonstrations, the Siddhi community convinced the state of government, state government of Karnataka, which on January 8, 1986, passed an order selectively including the Siddhi community in the list of backward tribes for the purposes of special treatment under Articles 15.4 and 16.4 of the Constitution of India with immediate effect. But not until 2003 did the federal government, the central government, acknowledge Siddhis under the scheduled tribe category. And that too, they only acknowledged a certain portion of Karnataka Siddhis, that is the northern, Uttara Kannada as it's called, northern Karnataka. Many Siddhis have not benefited from ST status, as remarked by a young Siddhi with whom I've worked very closely. His name is Juje Siddhi. I'm quoting him. Even if people know they are scheduled tribe, they are not aware of how to claim benefits or even what benefits they can get. They don't know what to do and where to go because of low literacy levels. Again, scheduled tribe status did not mean that the Siddhi community had claims on forest produce. From the 1980s onward, Siddhis began to organize in other ways to demand that the government allow them to continue their traditional livelihood in the forest. Many Siddhis in this area still rely on agricultural land and minor forest produce as steady methods for earning a livelihood, particularly honey from the forest and cane products that they make from bamboo. This is how they supplement their income. Although many Siddhis now perform wage labor, such as watchmen, tailors, truck drivers, and mechanics. Since the 1990s, Siddhis have also migrated to urban centers like Goa, back to where their ancestors began, where cities like Goa promise a lot more work and higher wages. Men work on construction sites and women work as domestic servants, mostly for Christian and Hindu well-to-do families. Literacy is still a problem, and primary education is available sporadically to the villages. Most villages, almost 60% or more, do not have primary schools in their locality. Towns like Mungod, Halial, and Yellapur offer better educational facilities with schools starting from nursery to 12th grade. However, villagers find it difficult to travel distances to towns. The roads are in poor condition, and inevitably many children go back to working with parents in their rural areas in agriculture or other jobs related to forest work. Many of those children who have completed 10th or 12th grade education continue to work on the land. And even when parents are eager for education for the children, they send them back to the farms to work because school facilities have crowded classrooms. There is high teacher absenteeism. And parents need labor, especially in the plowing season, in the harvest season. So the children are in some ways pressured to work back on the land and disrupts the school studies. This disrupts school studies. Now I go to the intervention of the state, the government of India, and this is where I'm looking at how Siddhi's asserted agency took the opportunities that came to them and tried to rebuild their lives, to move from just forest work or just domestic work in cities or labor into professions where they could get higher salaries. This began with the Sports Authority of India's Special Area Games that was started in 1986 by the Government of India's Department of Youth Affairs and Sports, and was suspended in 1993, but it went from 1986 to 1993. The Sports Authority of India, SAI, we move to the next slide. Oh, I beg your pardon. Here is another profession that Siddhis of Karnataka have, that is making quilts, kawandi, in their homes. This is what women do, and it's a project introduced by Henry Drual, Professor Henry Drual, University of Wisconsin, Madison. And this is from his essay in a volume that I just co-edited. Sorry, this is like an aside. I co-edited, called Afro-South Asia in the Global African Diaspora, with Kenneth Robbins, Omar Ali, and Jasmine Graves. So this is also one of the things by which Siddhis of Karnataka make a living. Let's go back to Sports Authority of India. Okay, I have a film to show you here. Sports Authority of India devised a scheme called Special Area Games. And the main person who designed this program was an Indian administrative officer, BVP Rao. He sought to promote the talents of youth in quote unquote tribal areas, which included Ornav tribe of Ranchi, Ladakhi people of Himachal Pradesh, and other quote unquote tribal communities. I want us to see this film, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this opportunity from Sports Authority of India was grabbed by Siddhis. I guess it's not moving.
हो गया तो न्यूज़ वाले आने लगे और पेपर में न्यूज़, और ये कौन बच्चे हैं, किधर से है, हम किधर नहीं देखे हैं, अरे अपना हिंदुस्तान में है, अफ्रीकन से, अरे बाप रे, अजीब बात है, कभी सुना नहीं। पहली बार जो गवर्नमेंट ऑफिसर्स जो आए थे अपने गांव, हम लोगों को दौड़ाए, थ्रो करवाए और जंप करवाए हैं, तभी हमको समझ में नहीं आया कि ये क्या करवा रहे हैं, क्यों करवा रहे हैं।
Since 1900, India has never won an Olympic medal in track and field. The Sports Authority of India believes passionately that India can win an Olympic gold, that talent does exist in the country. Only it must be discovered, nurtured and trained. For this purpose, the Special Area Games project was set up.
जी ने एक्चुअली सिद्धि बच्चों के लिए ही ये प्रोजेक्ट डालने का ये कारण है कि ये जो है अफ्रीकन मूलवासी है और अफ्रीका से आज वर्ल्ड स्पोर्ट्स एरिना में जो उनका जो परफॉर्मेंस है वो बहुत बढ़िया है। इससे है ना गवर्नमेंट को भी लगा कि ये जो अफ्रीकन पावर जो है ना ये अपना स्पोर्ट्स में इस्तेमाल करके हम भी ऐसा मेडल लेके आएंगे। जनवरी नवंबर का महीना हम लोग जा रहे थे, कोई ये भी पूछते थे इनको ठंडी नहीं लगती है क्या, अपने पैर में चप्पल नहीं थे, बेरफुट थे हम लोग। तो ये बच्चे जाने के बाद सडनली स्टेट लेवल, डिस्ट्रिक्ट लेवल या नेशनल लेवल, स्कूल नेशनल ऐसे मेडल लेके आने लगे।
Kamala Babu Siddi, 15, national record holder in the junior girls pentathlon. She broke the previous record by almost 200 points.
जो हमारे जो यहाँ के इंडियन सिद्धीज के अंदर जो फर्स्ट अंतर्राष्ट्रीय लेवल के अंदर भाग लेने वाला सिद्धि फिलिप एंथनी में ही हूँ। इस प्रोग्राम के अनुसार लाइफ के अंदर बहुत कुछ चेंजेस हुआ। ये सारा जो स्पोर्ट्स के वजह से ही अपना एक 2 एकड़ ज़मीन खरीदा मैं, स्पोर्ट्स के वजह से मेरे पास पैसा आया, स्पोर्ट्स के वजह से मेरे को नौकरी मिली। अगर ये CAG स्पोर्ट्स अथॉरिटी ऑफ इंडिया वगैरह करके नहीं होता तो मैं शायद एक मिट्टी के ढेला जैसे रहता।
सब लोग अच्छा परफॉर्म कर रहे थे और प्रोग्राम भी अच्छा चल रहा था, लेकिन सडनली ये 93 में सबको एक लेटर दिया गया हम लोगों बच्चों को कि विदाउट तुमको निकाला गया है तो घर जाओ करके। पता नहीं क्या कारण था, वजह था, इतना अच्छा करने के बाद भी और सडनली बंद कर दिया, सबको विदाउट कर दिया और घर भेज दिया सबको। सब लोग बहुत रोए भी, कुछ बच्चे घर आए, मैं उधर ही रह गया। मेरी मुसीबत ये है कि कोई सोसाइटी मुझे इवन पेइंग गेस्ट करके नहीं रखते थे, क्योंकि मैं अफ्रीकन लगता हूँ, क्योंकि मुंबई में हर जगह हम बदनाम हैं, तो बहुत फील करता है कि अपनापन नहीं लगता है। मेरा बेटा जुलेस के लिए अभी एक बार मेरा मिसेस पढ़ाते जा रही है कि एनिमल्स बता रही है, लायन है। जब भी चिंपांजी आया, वो छोटा था, तो वो बोलता है हाँ ये नाम से मुझे अंकल बुलाता है, मम्मी ये नाम से बुलाता है। तो हम दोनों भी शॉक हो गए, हम एक कंट्री के परमानेंट नागरिक है, तो यही पूरा जिंदगी झेलना है तो बहुत बुरा लगता है। जो हम डिफ़िकल्टी फेस कर रहे हैं हिंदुस्तान में, अगर ये डिफ़िकल्टी दूर होना है तो हिंदुस्तान में ये सिद्धी कम्युनिटी का अवेयरनेस आना चाहिए कि दे आर एग्जिस्ट एंड दे आर आवर पीपल, और वो सिर्फ स्पोर्ट्स से हो सकती है। हम सब जितने भी स्टूडेंट थे, वो उस टाइम के अधिकारी थे, हम सब मिलके गवर्नमेंट से यही कोशिश किए हैं कि फिर SCAG स्पेशल एरिया गेम स्टार्ट होना चाहिए। टाइम बिंग हम लोग अपने 20 बच्चे हैं हॉस्टल में, लास्ट ईयर से हम लोग स्टार्ट किए हैं। इधर है ना, इधर लेने के लिए ट्राई करिए, इधर फुल आगे लेने के लिए। यस, अभी टीवी ऑन होती है, ओलंपिक चल रहा है, वर्ल्ड चैंपियनशिप चल रहा है, तो अपने ईस्ट अफ्रीकन्स, केनियन, टांजानियन मैं देखा है, या इथोपियंस या सोमालियंस, जो खाने के लिए नहीं है लेकिन ये ऐसे भाग रहे हैं कि जैसा एथलेटिक्स स्टार्ट होता है तो उनकी मेडल टैली ही कुछ ये होती है, तो अपने देश से कुछ भी नहीं रहता है। वो जो गैप जो है ये हम पूरा करना चाहते हैं, ये अपना ड्रीम है।
Okay, I'm going to stop here and let me see. Okay, I just want to mention here that with such hope and such aspirations, Juje Siddhi, who is featured in the film, has revived the special area games after the government shut it down, because he believes that sports is much more than just winning a medal. He believes that those children who drop out of school and then during the off planting season, off agricultural season, they hang out by the roadside and have nothing to do, they can be brought back into the community with a sense of pride and dignity. So Juje has gotten a lot more out of sports from the special area games, as has Philip Anthony Siddhi, as has Kamala Siddhi. many of them got jobs because there is a quota in the government in various offices. For example, Oil and Natural Gas Commission. They have a special quota for athletes. So they take fill the quota from members of indigenous communities and scheduled tribe communities like Juche. So Juche did get a job in the government agency Employees Provident Fund. So they're looking at sports as a way up, as a leg up to rebuild community. And this is where they are, as they did with claiming scheduled tribe status, asserting agency, trying to talk back to that sense of dispossession, to that sense of being haunted by the legacy of slavery. But as you saw in the film, there is still the stigma of colorism and racism which the Siddi community faces in the city. So if we are talking about afterlives, they are still haunted by remnants of slavery and colonialism and colonial attitudes towards Africans, looking at them through Jungle Book, for example, and looking at them as animals instead of human beings. But what is interesting in what Juche said also in the film is that there is now a yearning for a diasporic identity. He is looking at those American athletes like Carl Lewis, Ben Johnson. He talks about Tanzanians, Somalians, and other athletes who have made a name. And he is aspiring to that kind of identity and reaching out to that kind of Pan-African identity, a different kind of diasporic identity. So that's one of the things also by which we can look at the resilience of Siddhis who do not accept victimization, who do not look upon themselves as oppressed. And at each stage, they have fought back. Now, another way by which Siddhis have creatively made inroads into the mainstream, one is by sports, but another is by Juliana Siddhi, Juche's wife, who began an advertising agency because there was a demand for African-looking models when African countries came to India to make commercials for their products on television, like Indomie noodles, for example. It's a big product in Nigeria. And the Nigerian advertising companies came to Bombay, where there is a big film industry and a big advertising agency also, many advertising agencies, and they wanted to make commercials. So Juliana Siddhi, by happenstance, became a model coordinator. And she brought children, adults, older people to Bombay to be models. And they got paid the rates that regular models are paid for advertising. So she gave back to her community. And this little film clip is about a rehearsal. Look at the number of children Juliana has brought from her village in Haliyal, Karnataka, and they all got 25,000 rupees, which is what is paid to models. And many of them went back and said, look, now I can pay for my college tuition, or I can pay for my school. Or a parent said, now we can afford a refrigerator, or we can buy a TV, etc. So even Juche wants to give back to his community with the Special Area Games project. And this is where they are contesting the afterlives of slavery. So let's just look at one more clip here. The rehearsal. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so this is Sports Authority of India, Special Area Games. And this is Juje's project. Since Special Area Games closed down, he also went back to the village to start sports and athletics. And this is just one of the photographs. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to do stop screen share and go back to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that rich talk and illustrating everything with films. There are so many questions and comments that I want to make, but I want to see if there are any questions in the chat, but I can't see any hands raised or any questions. So I think what strikes me is their agency, because in addition to the scheduled tribe status which the governments have given these siddhis in the Uttara Kannada, they are also coming out of the invisibility by becoming models and by becoming sportsmen and sportswomen. And so perhaps we are seeing a microcosm that we could export to some of the other parts of the world, because it's very interesting. And my own feeling is that this kind of role models, once they're established over several generations, and I've heard somebody say it takes 5 generations to get rid of color consciousness and racism, that perhaps one day we are going to have a world where people are, everybody can recognize each other, you know, for what they are, not for the color that they are or for the caste that they are. And India has a double problem because of the majority Hindu system within which all the others have to abide with. As Fred was saying, even Christians have that caste system. So yes, and the Pan-African identity is very interesting, how they are yearning for a diasporic identity, because scholars have questioned whether the Africans in Asia were entirely Asian or whether they could be considered a diaspora even. So I think you show that that debate, which comes more from archival historical work, is no longer true once you get into the field and start interviewing people and experience the lives and bring them, you know, the unmuted voices like Juje is beginning to speak, and you're seeing people coming out, emerging. So all I can do is to thank you if there are no more questions, because we are a bit short of time.
There is one question from Fred Noronha.
Yes, I can't see Fred's question. Would you like to ask?
What,
Fred, would you like to unmute and ask? Would you like
I can read it otherwise. He says, what is the way out, Dr. Shroff, in your view? Would more research help? Some NGOs have been working with them, Siddhis. I understand. What are the results? Are any state governments taking any responsibility? Thank you for that comment and question, Fred. I'll answer it as quickly as possible. That yes, NGOs are working with Siddhis, and in fact, the project by Henry Drual that I showed about making quilts, Kawandi, is one such collaboration where the quilts are then made in terms of marketability, and some are brought to United States and even sold. So cooperatives are being formed, initiated by Siddhis themselves. And they are trying to sell products through the Khadi village industries, the indigenous cottage industries, as they are called. So those kinds of things are also afoot. But I think I agree with you that more research is necessary into the everyday lives of Siddhis, as Shihan just commented. That changes the whole perspective from historical to our present day contemporary lives of minorities and silenced voices. So thank you very much for that comment. And if you like, we can move ahead, Shihan.
Thank you, Behrouz. So Shinli holds a PhD in transcultural English studies and Anglophone literatures. And for her PhD dissertation, she conceptualizes silence as a poetic category that informs the establishment of a mode of literary representation that relates ethically to cultural and historical other. She's the co-editor of a book series, Postcolonial Posthumanism, which is going to be published in Germany, in Münster. And currently, she is teaching intersectionality and gender studies at the University of Bayreuth. So over to you, Shin.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. You can start. Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes. My laptop is okay. Does it work for you guys?
Yes, I can see your first screen.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I lost the last part of it because of the connection problem. Thanks for inviting me to this event. I want to present the title of my presentation today, Speaking from Silence, Madeleine Nubis Phillips Looking for Livingston, and Odyssey of Silence. It is actually part of my PhD project that I try to publish. And because my focus is a little bit different from most of the people present today, and I have learned a lot from your presentations, but coming from a literary background, it may be a little bit different but it's a great opportunity. Okay, written by Madeleine Nubis Phillips, an award-winning Afro-Caribbean Canadian poet, writer and critic, Looking for Livingston, an Odyssey of Silence, is marked by its literary effort to give a voice to the unspoken past of the colonized Africa. A parody of a colonial travelogue, Looking for Livingston tells the story of a journey of an unnamed female traveler and narrator of the book who goes on a journey to the interior of Africa to trace the steps of David Livingstone, a 19th century Scottish missionary and explorer who was heralded as the discoverer of Africa and discoverer of Monsieur Atunya, which was renamed as the Victoria Falls. Along the way, the female narrator reimagines the colonizers' encounters with peoples and places, parodying and subverting colonial constructions of Africa, its peoples, its histories, and its epistemologies. Writers from marginalized groups have written alternative histories and offered counter-narratives in active resistance to the silences that have structured the histories of colonization and cultural exclusion. And yet, just as writers begin to address and give a voice to silenced perspectives in history, Toni Morrison, Gayatri Spivak, Tri Minh-ha, among others, calls attention to the ineffability of the past and warns against unquestioning use of language as a pathway to justice and empowerment. In her 1993 Nobel acceptance speech, Toni Morrison points out the inevitable entanglement of language and power, dominancy, and reduction. Language can never, according to her, live up to life once and for all, nor should it. Language can never pin down slavery, genocide, war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Literary projects that aspire to bring into words what has been silenced and erased in systems of knowledge production are thus confronted with one paradox. Their own medium of coming to voice is coded by the same structures of silencing and exclusion that they set out to resist. Morrison, while recognizing the limits of language, does not appeal for its abandonment. Instead of mastery and arrogance, she proposes an approach of proximity. Its, which refers to language's force, its felicity, lies in its reach toward the ineffable. A quote from Morrison in the same lecture, in the same Nobel speech. It is impossible for language to live up to life because we're epistemologically conditioned by structures that are inherently reductive and essentializing. And yet, the impossibility of giving full justice to lived experiences cannot and should not prevent a literary work from reaching beyond its bounds and towards it. In her strive to say the unsayable, Marlene Nubis-Philip, the author of the novel I am talking about today, underscores the centrality of silence in her artistry. In an article titled "Displace the Space Between," she says, each poem has its own silence technique, but the discerning of that silence and composition, how you shape the words around the silence. In line with Morrison's appeal for a craftsmanship that reaches toward the ineffable without claiming mastery over it, Philip advocates and practices an artistry of shaping the words around the silence. The prepositions around and toward reflect a shared deference to what is unsayable and a reluctance on the part of both authors to impose upon it. In this paper, I examine the idea of silence as a possible ethical approach to the unspoken past, and to explore how silence, central to both the ethical and aesthetical front of this literary intervention, paradoxically serves to articulate what has been lost in the process for colonization and knowledge-making. In the prologue of the novel, Looking for Livingston, it states, "For the ancestors who have been silent for too long and whose silence is always." Here, the narrative draws a distinction between the silence of the ancestors and the presence and potential power of their silence. On the one hand, silence with a small case S represents forms of epistemological violence and the erasure of voices of the ancestors in the colonial narrative. On the other hand, the silence with a capital S of the ancestors gains an ontological, whose silence is, I quote, an epistemological connotation that runs contrary to the common perception that prescribes silence to passivity and lack of meaning. This is almost paradoxical, and yet the narrative has found a way to philosophize and distinguish different registers of silence in its fictionality. The silence of ancestor is, with a capital S, as it conveys the ontological and epistemological significance of the lost meanings and knowledges, which is beyond retrieval. In fact, the whole narrative strategy derives from this very call to honor the presence of that silence and irretrievability. In the narrative, the ancestors, different peoples the traveler encountered on her journey in Africa, are identified as Eknelis, Singsil, Lansesi, Senile, Cecilians, Cleanus, and Nicholas. They are all different anagrams of the same word, silence. This speaks to a reluctance on the part of narrative to name, which comprises in itself a strategic embodiment of silence. It is not only reflective of the resistance to the violent and universalist components in the act of naming, of imposing language that institute hierarchization, objectification, and reduction, but also of a representational strategy in the parts of the novel where words are used in the narrative to shape and foreground its irreducible presence. This is the irreducible presence of the things that has been lost and forgotten. So between the 4th and 5th journal entries in the novel, the narrative is disrupted by a description of the recurring dreams of the traveler and the fictional conversations between Dr. Livingstone and Stanley, who was the reporter who traced, who was looking for Livingstone in 19th century and wrote reports and sent them back to Great Britain. This paragraph is all laid down in capital letters. He, Livingstone, and I, I take his word, strong and thrusting, that will not rest, will not be denied in its search to fill every crevice of my silence. I take it into the silence of my mouth, and in a clearing, in a forest, he sits and weeps as Stanley comforts him. I say, old chap, what's the matter? My word is impotent. I know that you're trying to tell me, Livingston, and I say the word. The continent awaits us eagerly, like W word. And you, a journalist, sir, how can you say such a thing? Don't you see, Stanley, without my word, the continent is beyond me, beyond us. In the colonial narrative, Africa has been cast in sexist terms, projected as a wild, silent space waiting to be conquered and possessed. Along with the sexist undertone is the humanistic embrace of language over silence. While language is mostly associated with reason and masculinity, silence is associated with femininity and passivity. In a quote, the narrative establishes what Linda Hutton calls a repetition with ironic critical difference through the employment of silence as a parodic device. Taking up the reference to Africa in feminine terms, the narrative performs a parodic inversion by transcribing the silence of the colonized subject, not in light of passivity, but of power and subversion. When I take it, his word, strong and thrusting into the silence of my mouth, the word becomes impotent. Silence deprives language of its totalizing power. Jennifer Rutherford, in her study of the Australian mythologies of the bush, argues that for the white settlers, the bush represents the primal mother, I quote, the primal mother, the monstrous, devouring being that is ever present, threatening to devour the explorer, the drover, the child. The act of the mouth devouring the word is a parody of the colonial imagery where the new land embodies the dangerous wildness that devours the lives of the Europeans. Instead of projecting the colonized space in terms of wideness and danger, the narrative turns its negative implications into a potential of critical departure. Once the word enters the realm of the silence of my mouth, the word is deprived of its power, an interesting reverse of the power dynamic between language and silence, and a proper caption for the very dynamic that plays out in the narrative, where silence is used as a strategic tool to check language and to expose the constructedness of the historical meta-narrative. In the event of the traveler's confrontation with the ghost of Livingston at the end of the narrative, she confronted him with, "You capture and seize the silence you found, possessed it like the true discoverer you were, dissected and analyzed it, labeled it. You took their silence, the silence of the African, and replaced it with your own, the silence of your word." The idea of capture and seize, possession, evokes a Levinesian sense of othering. As Levina approaches the nature of language and human understanding through the projected movement of the hand to grasp and to take possession, in a quote, the workings of the colonizer's words are cast in terms of objectification, dissection and analysis, and totalization, I quote, "You capture and seize, replace it with your own." History is a part of the imperialist enterprise of the same, a rational and coherent project where the singularity of the other, the silence of the African, is captured, reduced, appropriated, absorbed into an obscure, serene, stupefying totality. I quote, "The silence of your word." Your word, the instrument through which dominant historical narrative of presumed truth and objectivity are constructed, serves as the very means and instrument of power and colonial domination at the expense of the lives and knowledges of the groups that are other to the interest and the self-identification of the dominant group. The so-called truth or fact is never an inert, static, and enduring entity, but construed discursively in an entangled web of power relations. The dominant historical narrative is thus founded upon the construed silence of the colonized subject, in this case, the African. Language is never a transparent medium of knowledge and objectivity, and any attainment of coherence inevitably entails an inherent horizon of violence and possession. Challenging the instrumentalist view that characterizes language as a transparent representation of reality, the narrative points to the entanglement of power and language and the violent nature thereof. The word works through the silencing of the other in the construction of a historical meta-narrative that warrants its own legitimacy as representing the whole and objective truth, where the plurality and possibilities of meaning is being reduced to a monologic narrative. And yet, if every act of signification, each break of silence, consists of and predicates upon a violent erasure of difference and the stupefying neutralization of the other, how can literary works that aspire to an ethical mode of expression try to retrieve the unspoken past by way of language and representation, the very discourses by which that has been constructed as other has been captured, silenced, through which the other has been captured, silenced, used, and suffocated? The traveler professes the dilemma in her effort to bring to the fore that has been lost to the word. The traveler is betrayed by her own inherited linguistic impotence. And I quote, "There's the rub, the goddamn rub. You need your word to weave your silence." The traveler is trapped in a quandary, not in the sense that she cannot speak or remain silent and passive in face of cultural and historical silencing, but that she bites her tongue whenever she speaks. Her resistance cannot but be directed against her own means of expression. The rub is etched in the fact that even though language is the instrument of oppression and analyzation and is defined by its inability of fully represent the reality, it is the only medium of understanding that we inherit and are programmed to. The inevitable usage of the word to unmask silence harbors a paradoxical desire of language for its own lack, a doomed struggle of somehow locating an infinitely elusive element, a cursed attempt to articulate what, by definition, must remain silent. And contrary to the claim of some critics who thinks that silence is formulated in the novel as a new symbolic order that transcends the current one that we live in, the novel envisions a representational strategy where silence is pronounced, spelled out, and given space to. The rich insight that the text provides pertains, I would argue, more to the shaping words around the silence, a formulation that prioritizes silence in the enunciation of an ethical mode of understanding and the representation of the other. At the end of the novel, it is stated, "I surrendered to the silence within." The quest for an ethical approach to the other does not end with finding a way out of language, but a surrender of the word to the silence that is always and already within it. The surrender of the word to silence is the sum of the ethics and aesthetics of the narrative. I see it in connection to the Derridian formulation of ethics and hospitality, where to surrender or to give oneself to the other connotes a sense of self-sacrifice, self-disruption that comprises the essence of the narrative strategy of using words around the silence. The proposed way out of language is, in the imagination of the text, situated within a mode of representation that capitalizes on the deep entanglement between language and silence. In this sense, the narrative envisions an ethical approach to the other, and the source of its immense critical strength is anchored not in the desire to go beyond, but the way in which words could be used to shape it. So thank you for your attention. I hope it's within the time limit.
Thank you so much, and for keeping to the time limit. Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. And there are two questions that I have in mind. One was whether the Afro-American writers, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, who unravel silence, did Madeleine get any inspiration from them? And the other question was, why is she credited as M. Nubis Philip? Is it a strategy of gender subversion? And I wondered in her name, maybe I'm reading into too much African, Nubis. Is this indicative of her Africanness, her Nubian?
Thank you for your questions. Let me take notes. The first one is about, the second one is about the name. Do they have influence? I don't see any direct quotes from Morrison or Spivak in the poetic or literary works of Marlene Nobis Philip. And she originally comes, she's not original comes from, but she has a tobacco, but I'm not sure whether she was born there or she was already born in Canada. So I was not really an expert in her biography. And I am not sure about the name, if it indicates Africanness or that her choice to use M instead of Marlene would be a conscious choice, which was related to her, what you said about gender, evasion of gender. So that I can't really answer these names, these questions, that I can't really give you a definitive answer. Maybe especially the second one, you have to ask herself.
Can you see, thank you. Can you see any in the chat? I can't read any questions.
I don't see there is any question in the
I do have a question.
Yes.
For Professor Lee. Yeah, I do see M as a gender subversion, and I relate it to David Henry Hwang's parody of Madame Butterfly when he wrote M Butterfly. So according to my hypothesis, it is a deliberate gender subversion, not revealing who is addressing Livingston and parodying Livingston's adventure into the African continent. You might want to comment on that yourself. And what, sorry, you can answer that, and I have another question. Thank you for a very rich presentation. I loved what you analyzed. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, because it's not, it is a novel, it's a fiction, it's not really, the female narrator and the colonized subject, which is the narrator of the book, remains unnamed throughout the narrative, which was in accordance with the refusal of the narrative to naming and inherent violent implications that it entails. But M, it can be what you said, what we think maybe it was about gender subversion, but that was the name of the author, which I think is not related to the narrator of the book, narrator of the narrated voice in this novel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's great. And I know that she was named after Marlene Dietrich, the famous German actress. That's what I read in one part of her biography.
Okay.
What I like is that she asserts the fact that she is heir to the language of Shakespeare. She is very aware of the genealogy, literary genealogy, as a colonized subject. And that is why she has, there's the rub, the goddamned rub, which is a subversion of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the words he has used. And it is, she has almost invented a new genre of writing. As a colonized subject, she has the power to now utilize the writing. And as an anthology, reminds me of an anthology that is called, that's titled The Empire Writes Back. And there's another anthology co-authored by Hazel Carby in the early 1990s called The Empire Strikes Back. So for her, she has weaponized language to create of Livingston, as she calls him, old chap, you know, using all the British hail fellow well met words, and calling him Stanley. But then I find it problematic. After that powerful rendering, She says, I surrendered to the silence within, and I noticed that you analyzed it as a self-sacrifice. So is it a rebirth after the self-sacrifice, like the phoenix rising from the ashes?
I don't think so, because firstly, let's go back to the idea of creating a new genre. I would prefer this way of characterization than the other, maybe more radical way of saying that she is the narrative intended to kind of create a new symbolic. And that was some of the points that have been laid out, arguments have been laid out in critical works concerning this very novel. And it's also related to what I quote and my analysis of the last, the one sentence that wraps up the whole narrative, that is, I surrender to the silence within. And when I talk about when we talk about ethics, when we talk about sacrifice, it is not about what you said about rebirth, but I think it was really within that Derridean kind of theorization of what and there is a whole bunch of philosophies that goes into it. Levinesian philosophy was part of it that influences and Derridean. Derridean idea of hospitality. And that is, hospitality was tied by Spivak into the concept of responsibility. And that may be tied more into the post-colonial context when we talk about responsibility for the other. I surrender to the silence within. I understand it, I approach it as a statement of saying that I give in to the fact that I have a boundary, that there are things that is other to me. And I know that the otherness I cannot cover with my way of knowing the world through language. But I give respect, I give space, I give deference. I defer to that unknowability, irretrievability, that ineffability, and that is an ethical approach towards what is other, what is elusive to us, and what cannot be achieved, and what cannot be arrived at.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that absolutely changes my perspective. Thank you. That's very incisive. There is a comment, Shihan, from Ute Fendler.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, I can read it.
Yes.
Ute says, thank you for the very interesting talk. I wondered if there is a different way of communication apart from silence. Knowledge production not by words, then by silence or by body, like dance, painting, other forms. Very good question.
Thank you, Professor Fendler. So there is this first two parts I want to talk about. The first part is about silence and communication, because I try to, because in the work, silence is more like an analytical category instead of a form of communication. And it is talked about as an ethical attitude, an ethical aptitude when it comes to novelistic representation of the other in the post-colonial context. So it is more kind of a category of analysis instead of category of practice, for example, communication in life. So when we talk about silence, it's more like an ethical approach to novelistic representation of the other. But this is a very relevant question when you ask, how about not by words, but then silence on the body, like dance and painting and other forms, which in my analysis of the novel actually touches upon this problem of the through the very interesting gesture of the touch, because in this novel, very interestingly, the ghost of Livingston and the narrator and the female subject was ended up in that conversation. The very fiery conversation ended up in a very surprising gesture of touching hands, and the touch of hands was described as warm. I can feel that his hand is warm, just like mine. And that moment of touching, I believe, is a kind of I theorize it as a way of saying that that self and other, there is no total and absolute exteriority for silence and language. But on the other hand, there is also an indication that the body, the touch, and how it communicates, and how it goes beyond this identitarian and circular loop that we see in postmodernism and post-structuralism. And that is a very interesting perspective and that I think a lot of people are looking into right now.
Marie-Christine Parent earned a ethnomusicology PhD doctorate from the University of Montreal and also the University of Côte d'Azur in France. And she studied intangible cultural heritage and identity issues, relating particularly to mutia, a musical genre and practice from the Seychelles, which we're going to hear about shortly. Her research is on postcolonial societies, cultures, creolization processes, and cultural policies and artistic creativity relating to tradition and performance. And she herself is a musician. And she has published in numerous academic journals, including, and excuse my French, Music Cultures, Le Cahier d'Ethnomusicologie, Collegium Studies across disciplines in the humanities and social sciences and African music. And now she works as program manager in the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres de Quebec. And so over to you, Marie, and I'm particularly interested in listening to your presentation because I've been carnival time to Seychelles twice. So
thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join to this event. Can you hear me well?
Yes, fine. Thank you.
I'll start for real with my presentation on music of the slave in the Indian Ocean Creole Island, and more specifically in the Seychelles. Sega, Mutia, and Maloya are musical styles unique to the Indian Ocean Creole Island, respectively from Mauritius, Seychelles, and La Réunion. They all share a common history, musical and extra-musical characteristics, and are recognized as evidence of an African heritage in the archipelagos. In their traditional or official forms, these musical practices include singing, drumming, and dancing, elements that are usually associated to the African continent by the islanders and also by many specialists. In the Seychelles, local specialists do not hesitate to compare mutia to other Creole music from the Caribbean. Whether in relation to the themes addressed in the lyrics of the songs, the essential component of these practices, the song, voice, percussion, and dance, or musical and dance performances, there's no doubt that mutia is part of what Peter Manuel called the Neo-African traditional music, born in the colonies where African slaves were taken. In the official discourse and the collective memory, mutia, like the Maloya and Sega, refers to slavery. It is the music of African slaves by which they express their suffering, I've been told several times. The problem with this discourse, which consists of apprehending these music through their continental African origin, is that it fixes them in a historical past and in a frozen form. It fuels the idea that national Creole traditions, and I'll get back to that, like Sega, Maloya, and Mutia, would only be the preservation of the ancestral practices of Black slaves. However, these musical practices were born out of a specific historical context, namely slavery and colonization. In this presentation, I use the terms Creole and creolization to talk about cultural traditions and processes in the Southwest Indian Ocean Island for different reasons. As we know, the etymology and meaning of these notions vary depending on social, cultural, and historical context, as well as on the individuals and groups who use them. The music we talk about is practiced by population who consider themselves Creole and also speak a Creole language. Most researchers use the word Creole to describe people and culture of mixed ethnicity and cultural practices from contact zones created by the 17th century colonialism and slavery. Creole people and cultural practices emerge in the historical context of the plantation slavery and took root in new lands. In the Mascarene and the Seychelles, all inhabitants came from outside and had to find creative ways of surviving in very harsh conditions. In this process, that one could call historical creolization, new identities and cultures are created or recreated by mixing previously distinct elements and adapting them, most of the time by a spontaneous eruption, to new environments. The concept of creolization would have been introduced by linguists to designate the linguistic process which results in certain context situations in the appearance of new languages that became maternal for certain categories of speakers. The Creole of the island of the southwestern Indian Ocean are all French lexical based, colonization having been first carried out by France until the British came in 1810. With a new language, a new form of expression, which differs from the forms that preceded, come new references and meaning among a group of people. I consider that musical practices developed through a similar process of creolization in the island, and that they share common characteristics, like, for example, flexibility, inclusion, a propensity for change, and a great ability to adapt and cope with different situations and constraints. To consider that culture are not structure, not plural amalgam, but a continuum or a set of intersystem is essential to understand Creole cultural phenomena. The earliest record that refers to African and Malagasy slave dances in the Mascarene, practiced by men and women together, dates to the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. This could be the first expression of what will be called sega among the population, this Black music and dance, which will then be found in slightly different forms and as Creole self-sustaining musical practices on the Creole island of the Indian Ocean. Around the same period, sega has been identified in Mauritius, then Ile-de-France, as a Mozambican music and dance for which Mozambican musical instruments were used. They were not only drums, but also musical bow and tubular bamboo cedar. Malagasy music and culture were an essential component of the Creole culture of the Mascarene and Seychelles. Popular music such as quadrille and contredanse, with their origin among settlers, were also appealing to African slaves. During ballroom parties, Black musicians could occasionally join the band. Many Black musicians could assimilate Western music and dance gesture into African idioms in a process of creolization that could have occurred before the late 1830s. So the first expression of mutia in the Seychelles would have developed in the early 19th century, with the immigration of slaves and inhabitants coming first from Mauritius as well as from La Réunion, then mainly from Mozambique and Madagascar. The musical practices of slaves were then in full deployment from the late 18th century in the Mascarene. Like the Maloya from Réunion Island, Sega Ravan, sometimes called Sega Typique from Mauritius, and Sega Tambour from Rodrigue Island, mutia can be seen in the tradition of this primitive Sega. Mutia unfolded in a constant relationship with these musical practices, among others, over time. Sega is now a polysemous term referring to different types of music in the Mascarene and the Seychelles according to periods and territories. I would say it's typically Creole. So it is well known that musical practices of the African and Malagasy in the Mascarene and the Seychelles were not encouraged and were often prohibited by the administrative or religious authorities during the colonial period. Some Seychellois used to hide in the mountains to play mutia on Saturday night after work. Most people now aged around 60 and 70 years old, especially men, were sent to the outer island to work mostly in the coconut industry. Playing, singing, and dancing mutia was one of the main entertainment on the islands. Very often, they would share their musical practices with workers coming from Mauritius. Musician Bona Barbe told me about his life as a worker in 8 different islands in the Seychelles, and also on Diego Garcia. Back on Maui since the 1980s, the musician played in touristic hotel with the national troupe, but he said that modern Mutia played in hotel has little to do with what he experienced as a worker in the island. 1 year after the independence of the Seychelles in 1977, a coup d'etat came to establish a one-party system and what Seychellois called the revolution. As part of building the new nation based on the concept of creolité, the different musical traditions of the archipelago have been documented and put on stage, and cultural troupes were created in the different districts. At the same time, the act of playing music was very restricted during that authoritarian period and encouraged by the government in the structure they had put in place. Many musicians and dancers remember and share with me how Mutia suddenly became staged, the choreography is organized, and the lyrics composed and approved by a committee named by the government. By recognizing Mutia as an official part of the new nation's heritage, the government contributed to folklorize the Mutia that soon became for most Seychellois a music for tourists. Paradoxically, while the idea was to make all cultural practices Creole, local research and newspaper presented the different cultural style in relation to their African or European origin. On their side, Maloya and Réunion became a political tool for the Parti communiste from the 60s in reaction to the domination of the métropole française, and Sega became part of an important music industry in Mauritius and integrated the tourism industry in Rodrigue. In fact, recognition and legitimation of Maloya, Sega, and Mutia only concern the traditional or even the Africanized dimension of the music and dance. Stage show for tourists presented these music as coming from a distant Africa. Sega, Mutia, and Maloya found aesthetic transformation or adjustment, like the frequent use of percussion instruments without melodic or harmonic accompaniment, or dancer dancing barefoot, for example. Sega, Mutia, and Maloya, traditional recognized form, includes singing, drumming, and dancing. One or two men would improvise a song's lyric, and a group of women would answer back with high-pitched voices. Simultaneously, women dance, holding their skirt and swinging up the hips. Men dancers join them and select a partner, direct their attention to her without touching her until the climax of the dance. Musically speaking, these music all present a unique sort of polyrhythm that lies somewhere in between the Western 6/8 and 4/4, charged with rhythmic tensions caused by accentuated upbeat. Sega, Mutia, and Maloya strictly use Creole language, and sometimes old Creole, Malagasy, or African words, and double meaning is the norm. The form is often a call and response. Melodies often remind us of old and also use a lot of.
Une bonne idée, mais ça manque de goût.
Désormais, poursuivre leur description avec le sudiste normand. Indiqué que l'appareil est composé de gruyère, d'olive noire, de tomates séchées, de chorizo. Il est surmonté de tuiles de gruyère avec tapenade de tomates séchées et d'olive, ainsi que des chips de chorizo.
The body language of the dancer distinguishes these practices from other musical styles, those of European origin. So we will listen to some example by the end of the presentation. So with the return to democracy in the Seychelles in the beginning of the 90s, some artists reintroduced elements of Mutia in their music. These musicians oriented their research and creation from Seychellois music, not necessarily making them fit in these categories inherited from the colonial and post-colonial era. Now freed by a change in political philosophy, Seychellois can make their own selection in their traditions, and it may become strategically beneficial to take on, alter, or reject particular cultural expressions. Also, the influence of music from the neighboring island is never very far. The singer Jean-Marc Bolsy, that we can see on the picture, used elements of Mutia in his songs in the 1990s and got very popular in the Seychelles and in Mauritius, where he recorded most of his albums. And while Mauritius was vibrating to the sound of Segé of Kaya, a mix of Sega and reggae, El Manager introduced the Mugué in the Seychelles, mixing Mutia and reggae. So to express themselves musically, Seychellois draw on different traditions without denying the diversity of origins. Seychellois now generally present their music as a singular one from the archipelago. So when I arrived in Seychelles in 2011, I could not find what Seychellois call traditional or authentic mutia, similar to the video we will see later. The band Fek Arrivé was the reference, especially among young Seychellois, for the style musicians themselves named Sega Mutia. Their song Madeleine was a hit. We could hear it on the radio, in nightclubs, and also in different popular manifestations, like the carnival. Young to old people liked to dance on it, and it seemed to reach the old population and even tourists. The band leader at that time was Norviller Mesta. He left the band since then. He's from La Digue Island, and he is well known as a contredanse commandeur or caller. The initial band included Mauritian drummer recently moved to Seychelles, Christopher Rose, Seychellois from Maï, Elvis Séraphin, and Barney Burton, the latter being one of the last Mutia drummer playing in the continuity of the tradition of the older tambourier or drummer. Barney had to leave the group short after, and he was replaced by Bernard Dufresne, who played maravan or kayambe, an instrument borrowed to Mauritian Sega and Maloya from La Réunion, but almost present in all Mutia now, and André Medina on the djembe. This formation is not typical from traditional Mutia, neither Sega. Mutia drum being very rare in the Seychelles, Elvis and Christopher use ravan with a plastic membrane made in Mauritius. The djembe was recently introduced in the Mutia. Seychellois musicians usually sit on it and play it like if it was a rouleur from La Réunion or a groca drum from Guadeloupe. The second album of the band, Madeleine, was one of the biggest musical success in the Seychelles. The song Madeleine was already known as a French song, an old French song, forgotten by many Seychellois, but Norville made a kind of potpourri and a musical arrangement inside the song. As he sings the song, the aesthetic of his voice, as well as the rhythmic feeling of phrasing, reminds the one of the contredanse, these European couple dances, especially because he uses the calls. When the drum is playing on a Mutia Sega rhythm in 6/8, though adapted to fit in the 4/4 beat required by the contredanse, bass constantly plays in 4/4. The addition of a triangle and a rhythmic guitar imitating the banjo sound, the banjo being traditionally used in the cantolik and contredanse in Seychelles, and following the drums, and a keyboard line also imitating the banjo, doubling the melody in some parts complete the musical arrangement. Also, the tempo of the music is way faster than a Mutia would be. And the studio plays an essential role in the arrangement or in the process of creolization. We will listen to Madeleine later. So is Madeleine a Mutia? Oops, sorry. Is Madeleine a Mutia, a Sega, a contredanse, or something else? For most Seychellois, it is Seychellois music. I personally believe that Madeleine could fit this non-circumscribed category of Sega in the Seychelles, not to be confused with Sega in Mauritius. Most Seychellois can identify Sega music, but there's no consensus on the form and the origin of this music. This would be relevant for a relevant topic for further research. Given an interview to ethnomusicologist Michael Miller in the 1990s, Seychellois musician and politician David André said something very interesting. He said Sega could replace the word Creole. So we started this presentation with an emphasis on African heritage and the historical creolization process in the music of the Mascarenes Seychelles, and then observed the persistence of categorization inherited from slavery and colonization, even if these musical practices were officially labeled national and Creole. These categorizations and narratives about musical genre do not represent current musical practices, which provide in their expression and performance material to analyze and understand specificities of Creole cultures. We observe that Seychellois musicians and dancers have integrated multiple musical languages and share different practices regardless of their origin. For Creole population and individuals, there are many cultural references. Music in the Seychelles and the Mascarenes as Creole music are part of a tradition of continual changes, not only the result of original exchanges over time, but also a continued process with no geographical limit. Creole music is, by its essence, inclusive and always changing. Creolization must be understood as a process, a cultural dynamic, a strategy, a mode of being, which is not simply just a disposition to change as creolization is often understood, but the invention of ways of dealing with power.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for entertaining us and taking us on that wonderful journey on the Western Indian Ocean Islands. And I think the question we can ask, so many questions, but how come that different islands have different forms of music? And can you trace it to the demographics of African migration, right? Like from Madagascar or Mozambique? I mean, those were two sources, but is it the different ethnicities that make the dances different? Or is it the adaptation, kind of innovation on the spot? Or is it the other layers also that contribute, the instruments as well?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking. I would say it's not that simple, probably. From what we know, for example, in the Seychelles, we know that people in the Seychelles arrived mostly from Mauritius and La Réunion. So the population were more or less the same at a certain time. So I would say that, of course, the unique history of each island or archipelago makes a difference for sure. For example, I talk about the Seychelles, the experience of the authoritarian period, the Mutia, being recognized as a national music, national dance. All this certainly had an influence on the form and on what people made with it. So I think that each specific history has an impact on we could see that there are some similarities in La Réunion, in Mauritius as well, like this music being Africanized in a certain way in the three archipelagos, 3 islands. But at the same time, I think that each case is different and makes it different because from what we saw, I think that these music you could see similarities on the costume, the fire camp. So this is the national tradition. But when we look at something a bit more contemporary, like actual, this is a bit more different.
Thank you. And have you tried to compare them with the Caribbean islands?
Well, I did. Not officially, I didn't write on this, but of course I did because I was first more familiar with Caribbean music and with the music from the Indian Ocean. Like I said, I think there are a lot in common in between, like the lyrics, the fact that these are music, resistance music, the practice, the drum, dancing, and singing being the base of these practices. I think that I'm looking for him. I think that Dr. Cooley could answer at the same time from what he heard today. Yes, so yes, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of similarities, not only in the music themselves, but in the way that people will, I don't want to say use these practices, but yes, in a certain way, the way they, what it represents to them.
Yes, and did you find any spirit healing music that was associated with spirit healing or spirit possession?
In the Maloya in La Réunion, it is well known, it is still practiced, but Sega and the Mutia in the Seychelles do not have any relation with anything sacred.
Okay.
I just put something into the chat, but Segas were definitely recorded in Paris by the French Antillean musicians in the late 50s, early 60s. I assume they would have been for export, but I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, because I mean I know that Begins were recordings from Paris were sold into West Africa, but I was surprised to see that some of them were labeled Segas from that period. So I assume that they would have been exported to the Seychelles, but I don't know.
No, well, that would be a new information for me, actually. That's interesting. From what I know, from what people told me, the first, let's say, Occidental influence was around the Second World War, when Seychellois went to Egypt and then met other people from the Occidental. And then, well, Seychelles, I think the Highland have always been in contact with France, with England, because of their history, because of the so I'm not sure if I answer well to your question.
Well, I'm just partly making a comment because I was surprised to see that as a rhythm description on some of the French Antillean musicians' recordings from that period. And one would assume that that they were aimed to people that would know what the terminology meant. So I can't think there were, I mean, they may have been sold into the Guadeloupe, Martinique, what have you, probably were, but the fact that they use that term and it comes from a completely different area intrigues me.
Well, I'm not sure I don't know exactly what to answer. Yeah, I think I see. I think I see your point. Well, I think that most research that has been done. I don't know which period exactly are you talking about.
Well, I did this Creole discography, and it ends in 1959 or 60. Started 62, and certainly Gillisala, and I think one or two others, but I can't remember because I haven't got it in front of me, use that as a description for the music that they performed. And you know, if you're using it as a descriptor, then it must mean something to the person that's they're aiming the recording to.
I haven't done research specifically in Mauritius about the Sega. In Seychelles, it was very difficult to find the old recordings. The only recording I had, like the oldest one, was from 77 from Richard, not Richard, but Bernard Cochelin, who is French, from the Radio France Internationale. But I could not find any oldest recording in the Seychelles. So probably in Mauritius, and if I go into Sega.
Well, the trouble is all these things disappear. I mean, you can't find old recordings in Trinidad. Well, you can find some, but or Jamaica, or I don't know about Martinique or Guadeloupe. But I mean, something sometimes exists. But the problem with the tropics is that such items deteriorate very quickly.
Thank you, John and Maria. Are there any more questions in the chat which I can't see?
There are no questions in the chat, but I just wanted to ask Professor Parent where she found the recordings and whether they are, it's a rich trove of archival sources. So where did you find these?
Well, for the one from Mauritius and La Réunion, these are available now on YouTube. So I was in touch with some people, and by making research on archives, so I found this is available now on YouTube. The one from Seychelles is a bit more, it was more difficult to get actually, because I could not get it from the Ministry of Culture in Seychelles. It was difficult. They told me they didn't have anything. And so I went to Seychelles Television, Seychelles SBC, Seychelles Broadcasting Corporation. And after a few visits, I asked for any Mutia recording that they could find in their archives. And one day someone gave me this recording, this audio visual recording. So I have a few like this, which are very rare, but not old. Like this one, because it's SBC. We know that SBC was created in 1992, I guess, like SBC television. So it's not old. It looks very old, but it's not. So this is interesting as well, how they reproduce this old mutia. So, and the music, Madeleine, is, well, it's commercial in the Seychelles, not worldwide, but it's commercial in the Seychelles, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. What a wonderful archive you have collected.
It's very hard to have archives and to, well, they are part of France as well, so they also get funding from France, and they work very hard to document the whole area, not only La Réunion, but all different islands.
Yeah, thank you.
So if there are no more questions, it's a wonderful way to end the conference with 2 items of music and carnival in mind. I think all that then remains for me to do is to thank everyone, all the participants, some who stayed on to the very end, and the speakers, of course, who got up at various times and across various time zones, and to Beherosh for the masterful chairing of the event. And to Professor Philip Murphy, the director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, who encouraged me when I had this idea of convening this conference. And as you may or may not know, this is the Institute of Commonwealth Studies is the only academic institution in the world for the study of Commonwealth. So today we are particularly lucky to bring speakers from the Commonwealth and also talking about issues that are in the Commonwealth. And the Institute has done a lot to promote global dialogues between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. And I particularly know from the events that I have organized on migration and slavery. And these dialogues are very necessary now, as you know what's going on in the world. And the Commonwealth Studies is building on this archive of scholarship that it has, the conferences and the workshops that it runs, and the film screenings. And it has always had an open door to the public, and the public like joining these forums and asking, us questions about issues that concern their lives. So that's about all I've got to say. I mean, thank you for representing all the Commonwealth countries that you represented today. It's a family of Commonwealth people, and we are sharing common, common issues. But what brought home to me maybe is the afterlives of islands and also diasporas. So maybe we should think of having conferences in the future about diasporas and maybe about islands, because maybe islands have something, a more complex history. And the interaction of the layers of the colonizers makes it more interesting. Like Seychelles is a very good example and an example of success. But there are some examples that are not so successful demographically. But those issues are to do with sociopolitics. But we can go on discussing at other conferences. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of the day.